Now, before we get our hands dirty, let's understand deployment in theory. And let's start with the different deployment options NextJS gives you. Because it turns out that you have two totally different ways of building and deploying your NextJS app. The first and most common option is the standard build, as I like to call it. But we also can actually do a full static build and deploy our site as a full static website. Now let me explain what these two options mean. You do a standard build by running the next build command, or in your project where you have a package.json file, this build script which runs next build under the hood. We saw that command in action earlier in the course already when we talked about static page generation and so on. When running this command, NextJS produces an optimized production build, optimized production bundles for your application, and very important, it spits out a server-side application. The result of running next build is an output that requires a Node.js server to run it. So you can't take the output of next build and put it onto some static host. You would be able to do that for a standard React app, a non-Next.js app, but because Next.js has these built-in server-side capabilities, like pre-rendering pages on the fly on the server, revalidating pages, API routes. Because it has these server-side features, it needs a Node.js server to run that code. Should make sense. Now, don't get me wrong, pages will still be pre-rendered during the build process, if possible. So if you have pages with get static props or with no data at all, those pages will still be pre-built when you run next build. But you still have the Node.js server, as I just explained, for your API routes, which can and should only run on the server, for server-side pages that use the get server-side props function, and for page revalidations, which you might want to perform on your statically rendered pages. You also need a Node.js server for dynamic pages with get static paths if you have fallback set to true or blocking, because then some of the pages will be created on the fly when requests are reaching the server. And you need a server that is able to do that for that as well. So that is why you need a Node.js server for running the output next build gives you. And that has implications. It means that when you deploy that output, you need to deploy it onto a host that is able to run Node.js. And we're going to see that later in this course section. Now, when deploying a site, an application, you also typically need to redeploy from time to time. And when doing a standard build, you need to redeploy whenever your code changes, of course, because you want your latest code to be in effect in production. But you will also need to redeploy if your content changed, and you need to re-render some of your pages because you're not revalidating them on the server, because you haven't added that revalidate setting in get static props. Then if you have such pages, as we for example have them in our blog application here, in our blog site, there I have pages where I pre-render the pages with some data and I don't revalidate. If you have such pages, which is no problem, but if you have such pages, you will also need to redeploy whenever the content that influences those pages or that impacts those pages changed. Now that's the standard build, which you get with next build. For some projects, the full static build is a good option though. You get that by running next export, another command. We could run this in our project by adding a script for that. Here in package.json, we could add an export script, or however you want to call it, where we then run next export. Now, Next Export does something totally different than Next Build. It also produces an optimized production version of your application, but it produces a 100% static application, which means only HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, no server-side code, and therefore for hosting such a website, you don't need a Node.js server. Which makes hosting easier because you don't need to worry about scaling and so on so much, because there are plenty of static hosts out there which scale dynamically and are very cost effective. So having a static app which doesn't require a Node.js server isn't too bad. It can definitely make deployment a bit easier. But Next Export isn't always an option. Since it spits out a 100% static app, there are certain things, certain Next features, which you just can't use in such an application. For example, you can't use Next Export if your site relies on API routes, on server-side pages with get server-side props, on page revalidations, or if you have static paths with fallback set to true or blocking. All those things require code to execute on demand for incoming requests on the server. And therefore it's difficult if you have no server. So Next Export only works if you have a page which doesn't need any server-side code. Now, when building a page with Next Export, you have to be aware of the fact that that means that you need to redeploy your application whenever your code changes, but also whenever any content changes. Since you can't use page revalidations and fallbacks and so on, you need to redeploy whenever any content changed, because you'll need to export your application again. You need to rebuild all the pages again. Again, that might not be a disadvantage. That can be perfectly fine for a simple blog, for example. There, you add a new blog post every week, you do a redeployment every week. Not too difficult, just one step. And then Next Export can be a great option. In the blog application we built in the last course section, Next Export wouldn't be an option at the moment, because we're using API routes, for example, and because we're also using revalidations in some pages. And these are all features that require a Node.js server, since these are all tasks which will execute after deployment on the server for incoming requests. Nonetheless, these are your two options, and we are going to see both options in action in this course section.